just set up like that, it will absolutely astonish you. This is going to be a video about hi-fi. 20, 30 years. I've been a hi-fi consumer. I've worked in the hi-fi industry and I've worked in the pro audio industry. I've seen a lot of car hi-fi. But I've been inspired to do this by a guy called Robot Underground. This is information in regards to subwoofers. One aspect in particular that I was thinking about while I was in the shower today. What is hi-fi? And I don't mean what is high fidelity. I mean what is a hi-fi. What the diminishing returns actually means. You're going to spend more money and get less improvement. I'm going to start with lower grade hi-fi. What comes before hi-fi? At the bottom of the pile, you've got things like a single speaker portable JBL thing with a passive radiator, pair it with your Bluetooth, and then play music through. That's absolute bottom of the pile. One step up from that being a little radio. Back in the day when I was selling this stuff in Dixon's, we used to call it a CD STR or CD stereo radio cassette. And it's like a little boom box that you plug in, but it's got a couple more speakers and is a little bit larger. Next step up from that would be headphones, a little bit closer to a higher quality sound. There's going to be headphone users out there that absolutely hate me for saying this, but I don't feel guilty for saying it, having listened to some of the best headphone stuff out there. Stacks, not lots, but the brand called Stacks, and they're like electrostatic headphones that cost several £1000s with really expensive preamps and stuff, into various different DSP driven headphone preamps from Sennheiser with really expensive headphones attached to them to do all sorts of binaural sounds and DSP and all those sorts of things, and it still comes really low on the list because it doesn't come close to actually representing what hi-fi is trying to do, which is make the music sound like you've got the band in front of you. Headphones just cannot do that, no matter how clear they become. They're one step lower than the next on the list, which is car hi-fi. Can have some components in car hi-fi that are as good, if not better, than a lot of people's home audio. Possibly the worst environment you can listen in. Get it to sound reasonably near field, even though you're in a little glass box. But there we go. You can achieve that, I think, through time. Car hi-fi has sort of tried to make the best of a terrible situation, and it's still really low on the list, and still not hi-fi yet, even though you can have a really good grade of componentry in car audio. It's just never going to be the environment to produce a high fidelity sound. First thing on the list that I would actually call hi-fi, and it's not even going to be expensive, it just requires a little bit of sacrifice in terms of how you set it up. I only learnt this maybe 10 or 12 years ago. One of the things I learnt was about near field listening. You first step into hi-fi, it doesn't have to be an expensive system. So a chip amp from China can cost a tenner. A nice shiny light and a few functions on it might be $25. And then you can get a pair of Sony speakers that cost maybe $100, three-way little pair of speakers. At that stage, that's not a lot of money, most people say, but that's not a hi-fi unless you listen to it in a particular way. So a fairly average room with a coffee table in front of it. What you're going to do is run a power brick to that coffee table, on top of the coffee table, and plug the system into that. That is to say, you're going to have the amplifier with its little Bluetooth module and your phone with all your music, and the speakers set up so that they reach ear height, on camera, ear height, on some books. So the tweeters are level with your ears on your coffee table, and they're only going to be 40 centimetres away from you, very much in what's called the near field. So with no additional stuff done to the room, you're just going to have the speakers set up in a little triangle, everything equidistant, so you're about the same distance away from them as they are apart, and it's a very, very small setup. Not in a corner or off on a side wall, but just somewhere roughly in the middle of the room, on the coffee table that's in the middle, even if you're having to kneel down to do this, to listen to it. Sit and listen to it with it, like I say, about 40 centimetres from your ears. At that point, with $100, $150 worth of equipment, you have achieved high fidelity audiophile grade sound. Now notice I've not mentioned anything about cables, which are totally unimportant, but at that point, for $150, if you've got it set up left and right of your ears, pointing towards you directly, so the tweeters are pointing at your ear holes, about 40, 50, about a foot away, maybe a bit further, 1.5 foot away from your ears, very close, then you've got a hi-fi. And only then. If you set it up against a wall and you kind of walk around the room and listen to it, that's not a hi-fi, and it never will be. If you've got them set 2 meters apart and you're sat on your sofa and they're at the other side of the room and it's a 10-foot room and you're on the long wall, That's not a hi-fi, it never will be. But 40 centimetres from your ears, in the middle of the room, sat up on a coffee table, on some books, bringing the speakers to ear height, just set up like that, it will absolutely astonish you what that will sound like. So there's 150 bucks, nothing done to the room. The next step up from there is a fairly considerable size jump in terms of how much you'd have to actually spend to achieve something better. And it's all to do with scale. So as these next steps through high fidelity go up in price, all that you're really doing is giving yourself the ability to push that system with that fantastic sound that you got at 40 centimetres from right in front of you, really intrusive, further and further and further and further away from you. And not have the room take over the sound. So if you let the room take over the sound at this point, as it gets further from 40 centimetres away, all that's going to happen is it's going to sound like a mess of mud. That's all that's going to happen. It's not going to sound like it did when it was right in front of your ear holes. So the next step up would be to get it beyond where the coffee table is in your imaginary lounge, wherever you're sat listening to this. So that'd be 2.5 feet, let's just say. That's where you're going to now have some stands, actual speaker stands, which may cost a couple of $100, not cheap. So we're starting with stands. You're also going to get rid of the coffee table, that's got to go. So there's going to be nothing between you and this very small setup still. There's going to be a couple of feet away from you. But again, on speaker stands that raise the speakers up to about ear height. And instead of using maybe $100 worth of Sony speakers with very flimsy, unbraced cabinets and relatively cheap drive units, you're now going to buy decent drive units, basically nice speakers. So the chip amp stays exactly the same, and you're going to buy, I don't know, a pair of Dynaudios that cost $500 or something. They've got really nicely made cabinets and really nicely made drive units, and flatter, nicer speakers. Hopefully go a little bit deeper in bass as well. But it's not just $700 for these speakers and stands. You're also going to have to treat the room now. So now there's going to be, even at this small scale, an interaction with the room where you'd have to treat the first reflections, which is to say that if you had a mirror on the wall to your side and you moved it along the wall, you would eventually, in the mirror, see the speaker. That's where you'd put an acoustic panel, and that would lessen the first reflection in that very small setup, and that might cost another couple of $100 if you buy them pre-made to go on the wall, as thick as you possibly can, maybe 6-inch thick, deep panels. So that's the next step for maybe $1,000. Much the same quality that you were at 40 centimetres, it's just less intrusive, and the scale goes up, it sounds bigger. You've got more range of frequencies, speakers go a bit deeper, not on top of you, you know, they're in the middle of the room. Stand mount speaker to the thing that can go further out, well, potentially a bigger speaker. So a floor standing speaker that goes maybe 6 feet away from you, and again in a triangle, but now you've got a massive interaction with the room. So now maybe double the distance it was previously, the entire room is going to take over everything in that sound field. So everything that you're listening to at that point is going to be room. So you have to get rid of it. You have to spend probably triple or quadruple what you've just spent on $1,000, maybe, let's call it an expensive set of floor standing speakers, to acoustically treat the room, to stop it being involved with the actual sound that you're hearing, instead of everything being a reflection off a wall. You just want to hear what's coming directly from the speakers. So that is going to cost a considerable amount of money. At that stage, that's where most people don't treat the room. They just buy more gear. They just buy a $3,000 or a $5,000. They think that buying more and more expensive amps will make the room go away or sound better, which is what they're trying to achieve. And it never does. Fidelity experience a foot away, to sticking it on a pair of stands, to sticking it on a pair of floor standers, at which point you've got to completely change the acoustics of the room in order to get a decent performance out of that. You've gone from, I don't know, what did I say originally, $150 up to $1,000, and now we're up to, for the next step beyond that, $3,000. In my opinion, though, without spending probably $2,000 or $3,000 on the room, when you've got to those sorts of distances, maybe 6 feet away, you're not going to see the benefit. It'll get worse. You know, once you move out of the near field, all you need to keep it as a high fidelity performance system is to get rid of the room. And at that point, it's going to be the case that you're going to need to spend more on room than on hi-fi in order to still achieve that. So by the time you reach the point where most people have their sofa in a normal position against one wall and the hi-fi in a normal position, spread out in a reasonable way, still in that triangle perhaps, but on the other end of the room, normally where most people make the mistake, and then they see what they think is diminishing returns as a result of them not actually going through the process of getting rid of the room when they're trying to get a high fidelity performance. So next step, after going up to maybe £1,000, $1,000 set of speakers, $1,000 amp, and $1,000 or $2,000 worth of room treatment, is just up in scale. So do you want deeper bass? Well, then you add a subwoofer at that point. So you've got a 2.1 system that will extend the bass range louder and lower. Just how much space do you want to fill? In other words, if you've got a much larger space, from the $1,000 speakers, you might go up to $3,000 speakers just because they're bigger and can fill a bigger space. And maybe you might need an extra subwoofer, but only because you're going into larger spaces than the ones that were detailed a moment without spending vast amounts of money, which is doing it yourself, building speakers yourself, or learning how to, or finding somebody that's interested in doing it, buying drive units from parts suppliers rather than hi-fi manufacturers that build the speakers and sell them to you as a complete unit. That way you can buy a speaker of a performance that might be $1,000, and you might only spend a couple of $100 actually on the parts and on the wood to build it. There's also other people that do a halfway house that sell them in flat packs, where you can buy componentry and the bits to assemble the speakers and the crossovers, put them together, and it costs half the price of something that might be sold on a shelf from a speaker dealer. So there you go. So that's the way to hi-fi. But there is a break point, which is to say that once you've actually reached about the $150 situation with a near field, that's hi-fi. At that point, you've got a hi-fi. So, as I say, all you can do beyond that in terms of improvements is push it further away from you and hopefully keep the essence of the quality of the sound reproduction still reaching your ears without the room taking over. And that will cost more and more and more as you get further and further and further away from the speakers if you want to retain high fidelity sound. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors in high fidelity sound because cables are an unregulated part of that industry, and the biggest opportunity to up the margin on a particular sale. So cables are a waste of time. They're not magic. You just need whatever is adequate to transfer the signal from one part of the system to the next. You know, a couple of bucks a foot, or maybe £5 a metre here in the UK. It doesn't need to be any more expensive than that. It's just not necessary. You'll be told that it is, and it just isn't. The gear secondarily to the room, if you're trying to actually get this to be a high fidelity system that works in a room, which most people are. Most people don't want to sit and listen to a pair of bookshelf speakers at 40 centimetres away from their lugolls. But that is the way to achieve it if you want to find out what a hi-fi sounds like. Most people have never heard of hi-fi, me included, until I started learning what a hi-fi reproduction actually was in studios, at which point I learned what the near field was and how to achieve that in a untreated room without any decent equipment. And you can do it for next to nothing. It doesn't cost a great deal of money to do it. It does cost a great deal of money to push the range out in terms of how far they are from you and the scale of sound that they'll produce, i.e. how loud it will go and at what frequency, how deep it will go. That's it. That's all you get for more money.